All right, folks, welcome back to another fun-filled week of pre-licensing. It is so good to see you all. I hope you all are doing lovely and then some, as they say. How's everybody doing tonight? Sure, why not, right? It's another night. It's class. It is what it is. Sure, why not? I'm with you. Goodness gracious. Great balls of fire. Folks, we got all kinds of fun-filled things to talk about this evening. Lots more education to get through. So, first, let me say, if I'm not mistaken, we left off at the legislation, lending legislation, right? RESPA, TILA, is that where we were having discussions last week? Yeah. That's what I was thinking too. So that is where we're going to pick up. So really briefly, before we dive right in there, folks, any questions, comments, concerns about anything you've seen, not understanding that you need me to explain it to you real quick like? So, quick little recap, folks. We have been diving headfirst into the financing section, and boy howdy, is it a lot of fun. Everybody loves financing. Everybody wants to do nothing but talk about financing all day, every day for the rest of their lives. I know. So, we've talked about loan types, government-backed loans. We've talked about FHA, VA, USDA as the government-backed loans. We talked about the things that cannot be in a promissory note associated with a government-backed loan. The two things that cannot be in government-backed loan promissory notes are what?
Repeat that question.
Yeah, when we talk about the government-backed loans, there are two things that are prohibited from being within the promissory notes for these government-backed loans. What were they?
I think it was prepayment penalties.
There you go. Prepayment penalty clause is prohibited in government-backed loans, and one other.
Acceleration?
Not the acceleration. Every loan can have the acceleration.
Not the alienation.
Alienation. Alienation, also called the... I'm going to pray for y'all.
That is, you remove yourself from the ownership, something like that.
The due on sale clause.
Yeah, you don't say.
Alienation clause, also called the due on sale clause. Neither of those, the prepayment penalty clause nor the alienation clause, can be in government-backed promissory notes. So they are always assumable, and you can never be penalized for paying them off early. So we talked about the government-backed loans, where the government typically subsidizes the insurance and the FHA, or in the VA case, the government guarantees that amount. Remember, it's not full insurance coverage on these mortgages. It is basically helping with that spread between the down payment that they would have liked to have seen and the down payment that you gave, because these government-backed loans are typically higher risk loans with lower down payments. So when we say conventional loan, that is not a government-backed loan. So what do we call that? That is a what type of loan?
Private.
Private. There you go. Private, which means who bears all the risks?
The lender and
Yeah, the lender. That's enough. The lender. Yep. And so when you get insurance on those, it is called private mortgage insurance versus the government backing, which is just called mortgage insurance, because it is not through a private institution. It is government subsidized. More than that, folks, what is the magic down payment number or equity number that banks want to see you have for a conventional loan where you would not need private mortgage insurance?
20%.
20%. There you go. The other things we talked about were the financial theories of states. And so there were what two state financial theories?
You talking about title theory? And,
That's the only theory we talked about, isn't it?
okay.
Yeah.
theory.
In theory, that's the only theory we talked about. Yeah, title theory versus lien theory. Which one is North Carolina?
Title.
Title theory, which means we utilize what security instrument?
Deed of trust.
Deed of trust. Deed of trust. How many parties associated with the deed of trust?
3.
3. Who are they?
The grantor, beneficiary, and the trustee.
Grantor, beneficiary, trustee. That's exactly right. Grantor is the borrower as well. Beneficiary is the bank, and the trustee is an attorney who works for the bank who holds that naked legal title. That's exactly right. Lien theory states use which security instrument?
They use the mortgage.
The mortgage. How many parties?
2.
2. Who is who?
Mortgagor and the mortgagee.
Okay, and who is who?
The mortgagor is us because mortgagee is never me.
There you go. Mortgagor is the borrower because the mortgagee is never me, right? That's the bank. You give, as the borrower, you give the bank the mortgage that says, I promise, I know you can take the house if I don't pay you back. And that's security instrument. So we talked about that. Then we got into some flashcard level stuff as well. Blanket mortgage, construction loans, package loan, all that's flashcard level. Make sure you know that. We're not going to spend time reviewing that because that's not crazy testable. And so we ended up here where we got into financial legislation. Now I told you folks, back in 2008, 2009, there was a big housing market crisis, and it was due to subprime lending, giving mortgages to people who didn't qualify for them. Not having the appraisers be, unbiased. There was a lot of things that went into it. And so the biggest thing was what was called the Dodd-Frank Act was passed. And the biggest things that you need to know about the Dodd-Frank Act is that it created the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which became the oversight agency for 7 different government agencies, including the Fed. They also are the regulation agency who oversees these pieces of financial legislation that were actually already in place. RESPA and TILA. TILA is the Truth in Lending Act. RESPA is the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, but nobody was enforcing them before the creation of the CFPB. So what they did is they reformed them, they updated them, and now they enforce them, very much so. So they are taken very seriously nowadays compared to where they used to be, where they were not taken seriously at all. So, a couple things that you need to know about RESPA. Of course, RESPA only deals with real estate closings, and it has to be purchased with a loan from a federally backed depository. If you're purchasing a home with cash or a private loan or a commercial property, none of those would fall under the restrictions of RESPA. They would not have to follow all the same rules that RESPA states, their transactions have to follow. So when we're dealing with this, some of the other big things is, of course, you have to be given the shopping for your home loan book or toolkit. I told you it could be called either way. When we're dealing with the fees set by the lender, I told you those can't deviate. So in other words, when you apply, and we're going to show you this in the next slide, when you apply for the loan, the lending institution has to give you a loan estimate within 3 days of loan application if they are going to approve you. And on that loan estimate is the estimate of all costs associated with the loan. Their costs as the lender and costs that are just blanketed averages for things like attorney fees, title insurance, closing costs, things of that nature. The things that are in the lender's control cannot deviate from that loan estimate. There is a zero tolerance for change. The things outside of the lender's control have a tolerance limit. They can increase or decrease, no problem. It also limits the amount of monies the banks can hold in your escrow account. So when they open that account for you, they can't hold too much of your money. If they ever have too much, they have to give it back, and they can't ask for too much at closing. And then I told you, kickbacks and rebates, they are prohibited from settlement service providers by RESPA. In other words, I said that you cannot give or receive money from your lender, your attorney, your surveyor, your title insurance company, your homeowner's insurance company, anything that was part of closing or getting to closing, you could not give or receive referral fees from them. Now, understand that broker-to-broker referrals are always okay. Do not get tripped up on a test question where it says that a broker referred, a buyer to another person and they got paid. Is it a violation of RESPA? Never. Agent, like real estate broker to real estate broker referrals are never a violation of RESPA. Those are okay. So as we expand here, we start getting into additional conversations. Looking around like a crazy person because I don't know where I put my clicker. It'll be all right. Struggle of teaching all day. So the next couple pieces of RESPA, okay, I told you, you've got to be given this loan estimate. Now, this is where I told you the business versus banking day conundrum. If you were to Google it, business and banking days are the same from every legal point of view. However, for the sake of RESPA and more specifically the TRID rule, business days are Monday through Saturday. And so when we're dealing with this, you have to be given the loan estimate within 3 business days of your loan application. This is a 3-3 thing. You have to be given this loan estimate within 3 business days of your application, and then you have to receive another document at the end called the closing disclosure, 3 days prior to settlement. So it's 3 at the beginning for the loan estimate, 3 at the end for the closing disclosure. So either way, it's 3 days, business days. Now this bottom piece says any lender denial must be in writing. Folks, there is a piece of legislation that says that it has to be in writing. We haven't gotten there yet, but it's called ECOA, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. That deals with discrimination in lending. So they have to put in writing why they denied you. It's okay for them to say it's because you're broke, you have bad credit, you're non-trustworthy, you have a terrible job. They can turn you down for those reasons, but it can't be because of anything discriminatory. There are protected classes under ECOA that we'll talk about shortly. So RESPA applies to most home purchases, right? Because they're residential and they're getting a loan. And of course, every RESPA transaction is automatically a truth in lending transaction, and that's where this TRID rule comes into play. It is the TILA RESPA Integrated Disclosure Rule. And so you just get one loan estimate and one closing disclosure. The closing disclosure is what you get on the backside. So loan estimate is what you get after you apply. Closing disclosure is the document you get 3 days prior to closing. If you do not get it within 3 days, business days prior to closing, you are not closing on time. Now, there are waivers that a borrower could sign, but it's not typical for them to sign them. But they do exist. And so it's 3 on the front end, 3 on the back end. And then the other thing is they have to acknowledge the receipt of it. And so most of the time it's sent in an online portal where they sign a document acknowledging that they've received it. If it was mailed, they consider it, to be delivered after 3 days after they mail it. So that's why it says 6 days before settlement, because they have to mail it and then they consider it to be delivered 3 days after they mail it, and so you still need that 3 days leading up to settlement. That's why it's 6. That 6 shouldn't be testable, though, really and truthfully. It's just the 3. Now, folks, understand that when you get your loan estimate, the whole point of this is to help you understand what you're agreeing to. Because as I said last week, if you were to get a loan, and somebody said you're borrowing $280,000 at 6% interest over the next 30 years, none of you have any idea how much that's actually going to cost you. The whole point is to show you what is the cost over the life of the loan? What is your monthly principal and interest payment going to be? How much is going towards taxes and insurance? How much are you going to pay it down? It's going to give you all that information on the loan estimate and the closing disclosure. The idea is they are checks and balances for each other. What you got on the loan estimate should closely match what you got on the closing disclosure. And if it doesn't, we got a question. So the closing disclosure is your last opportunity to say, am I sure I want to do this? Now, please understand, even if you change your mind, it doesn't change anything with your contract. You're probably still screwed, contractually speaking. But that is why this exists. This is just talking about what we were saying, residential transactions. I'm not going to waste time here. Here is ECOA, as I mentioned it, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Now, folks, let me make a very important statement here. This is going to suck. there are two big discrimination laws that you have to be aware of. And in fact, there's more than that. It's just that we group a couple of them together. ECOA is one, Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Fair housing is a different one. Understand the difference. ECOA applies to all lending. Getting a credit card, getting a car loan, getting a home loan. ECOA deals with borrowing money. And there are protected classes under ECOA. There are also protected classes under fair housing. Fair housing deals with buying a place to live or renting or whatever. So one deals with where you live, one deals with borrowing money. Now, if you look right here, race, color, religion, national origin, and sex. That is both part of ECOA and fair housing. Race, color, religion, national origin, and sex are part of both fair housing and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. However, these down here in red are unique to ECOA only. Marital status, age, and dependence on public assistance. So if you got a question that says somebody was denied credit because they were 92 years old, that is discrimination under ECOA. Now, let me point something out here, folks. There is a couple categories that are not on here that you will see are on the fair housing one, like disability or handicapping condition. That's not on here. So if you got a question that says somebody was denied based on familial status or they were denied credit based on handicap, that is not a violation of ECOA because it is not on the protected classes for ECOA, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And these are the types of questions you will get. This is where I told you, do not answer with your emotions because you're not going to like it, but what you're designed to answer is the law, the rules, the legislation. So, race, color, religion, national origin, sex are on both. Marital status, age, and dependence on public assistance income, ECOA only. So another thing to talk about in the lending side, which you could absolutely see on your test, is just the discussion or statement in regard to what we call loan fraud. Folks, pretty self-explanatory. Loan fraud can happen in a couple different ways. One of the most common ways is lying on your application, falsifying documents, saying you make more money than you do, things of that nature. But there's sometimes other ways that people commit loan fraud that are as equally bad and illegal and way more common. Let me give you an example. If you were to purchase a home and your mom, your dad, your grandparents, somebody was to give you some money to go towards it. Well, the banks don't typically like that because that means you're getting a loan from a family member. And so the only way that the banks are okay with it is if it is a gift. So what do they make them do? They make them sign a letter of gift. When they sign that letter, they are swearing under penalty of law that they do not expect it back. That's what a gift means. If you are repaying that money back to them and they sign a gift letter nonetheless, you have just committed loan fraud. Because you just said that it was a gift, but it's actually a loan. Now, loan fraud is punishable by fines up to $1 million and up to 30 years in jail time. It's a big deal. Now, this next little segment that I'm going to get into, folks, I'm going to be completely honest with you about something here. We're going to have a conversation about income qualifications and things of that nature. I'm still looking for my clicker. It looks like I'm just aimlessly looking around. I taught this morning. I don't know where I could have put it. Who knows? But here's the thing. I honestly am not going to spend probably any time on explaining the math to you, and I'm going to tell you why. Now, when we get into the complexities of the loan qualification math coupled with the amortization schedule, if I'm being honest with you, if you're not comfortable with math, take the L. It is still just one question on the test, and the amount of time it takes to fully understand the lending qualifications coupled with amortization schedules, it's just not worth using that much of your time studying for like one question, in my opinion. I just wanted to put that out there. So I'll give you the brief kind of version of this, but I'm not going to go into the crazy calculations that you could potentially see on the test. So here's what I mean. When you want to buy a house, of course, there are a lot of different components that come into play. The bank wants to make sure that you make good money. They want to make sure that your debt-to-income ratio is solid. We call it a debt-to-income ratio because if you make $2 million, but you spend all $2 million, you're broke. If you make, $50,000 a year and you only spend $6,000 a year, you've got a pretty steady source of income. So it's called a debt-to-income ratio to see where you're at compared to what you bring in, what you spend, not just how much you make. The other thing they want to see is, of course, stability. So they want 2 years of work history of the same job, or at least, same job field, could be different locations potentially. Other things that come into consideration are your credit score. Credit scores show that you have a history of credit and that you are reliable to lend to, typically get you a better interest rate. And so all of these things get coupled together. And I'm going to be honest with you, there are ratios that we teach you in this class. They're not exactly that to a science. If you ask a lender when you get your license, if these ratios are what they actually use, they will laugh. This is the generalization that we give you based on a pre-licensing course. So let me explain this, folks. If we're dealing with a conventional loan, you've got these two ratios, and they are checks and balances with each other. It's called the 28 and 36% ratios. Now, this is based off your gross monthly income. Let's say you make $80,000 a year. We are looking at this as your gross monthly. So $80,000. By the way, what does gross mean?
Before taxes.
Yeah.
Comes out.
20% of my money.
Yeah, right. Before taxes and other expenses and all that good stuff. So if you make $80,000 a year gross, divided by 12, your gross monthly income is $6,666.67.
That's a horrible number.
Yeah, I was waiting for that. Oops. But either way, so here's how this works. The 28 and 36% ratios. 28% says that your total housing expense cannot exceed 28% of your gross monthly income. In other words, if you take your gross monthly of $6,666.67 and multiply it by 28%, we are saying that your total housing expense under the 28% rule cannot exceed $1,866.67. Now, when I say total housing expense, that means your pity payment plus any HOA dues. If you've got monthly HOA dues, those are part of your housing expense. So that's what 28% means. They will not lend you money that exceeds that number of a monthly payment. Let me explain the 36% rule. The 36% rule says if you take your gross monthly income of $6,666.67 and multiply it by your 36%, what this is saying is that your total recurring obligations, including your housing expense, cannot exceed this number. So let me explain what that means. Let's say that you have a $300 car payment and a $300 credit card bill that you are paying each month. Well, your total recurring obligations cannot exceed $2,400. So take out your $300 car payment, take out your $300 a month credit card payment. The total amount you have left that can go towards housing is $1,800 because you have to take out your other recurring obligations. That's how these numbers are utilized, and I'll explain to you why. When they look at these numbers, the bank is trying to decide between these ratios how much they're going to lend you. And as I said, they are checks and balances for each other. They will always only approve you for the more restrictive number. Well, folks, not being able to afford 1866 and only being able to afford 1800 is the more restrictive number. So if this was your financial situation, they're going to say, okay, no, based on your recurring debts, your housing expense cannot exceed 1800. These are checks and balances for each other. Let me show you why. Let's say that you are one of the lucky few who has their car paid off and has no credit card debt. So if you have no recurring obligations, that leaves your 36% ratio at 2400. But the bank's not going to give you that because they will never break either rule. If they were to give you a housing expense of 2400, they have broken the 28% rule. They are checks and balances for each other. Here's why. How long is the average mortgage for? There you go.
30 years.
30 years. What is the likelihood that over the next 30 years you will not have child support, you will not have alimony, you will not have a car payment, you will not have a credit card bill, you will not have anything like that? What are the odds?
Very slim.
Very slim. Yeah. And that's why they're not going to just give you this 2400. These are checks and balances. They will never break either rule. So if you've ever heard of a situation where somebody's trying to buy a house and they had to pay off their car to qualify, it's because they had to eliminate some monthly debt to change the threshold on their debt income ratio. This one put them too low. By paying off their car, they were able to now get this one. That's how that works. Does that make sense for everybody? So,
For example,
go ahead.
one of my friends is a GC, and he was trying to help somebody get qualified, and they were going over their debt ratio, and they were complaining he did everything. Their credit score is like a 780, so it's not anything to do with their credit. But their vehicle payment is $2,100, and he said, if you get rid of this payment, and they said, but I got to drive this particular car, and he said, well, you either got a house or you got a car. You got to choose which one you want.
Is it made of gold? What the hell kind of car do they drive that's a $2,000 a month payment?
Some kind of Lincoln. I don't know.
You'd be surprised. When I used to work at the car dealership, I got people to sign on $1,300, $1,400, $1,500 a month payments all the time, like on a weekly basis.
That is the stupidest crap I've ever heard of in my life.
No, that's how much it costs for like a Jeep Grand Cherokee.
I guess with terrible credit and no down payment.
It was the interest rates, yeah.
Yep. Lord. That's gross. People are dumb.
So I sold somebody a car once with a 19% interest rate.
People are dumb. Anyway, so that is what the 28 and 36% ratios are. Yeah, that's what I was thinking, Justin. A G-Wagon or a Rolls Royce. I get it at that point, right? If that's my payment on my Lambo, I'm cool. If it's a Jeep Grand Cherokee, I have failed at life. If my payment is $2,100 for a Jeep Grand Cherokee, I'm like, no, I need you to drive this Jeep Grand Cherokee. I'm going to lay here, just run over me. I've just made some bad decisions. I got to go. Okay, just run me over. No offense to any of you if that's your current situation. I'm sorry to be insensitive. I apologize. So that is what these ratios do. Now, for conventional, it is, at least for testing purposes, at least for class purposes, 28 and 36%. I told you, if you ask a lender in the real world, it's not quite that simple. But of course, you don't need to know how it actually works. This is enough. So if we're dealing with government-backed loans, the ratios are different. FHA is a little more lax. It's 31 and 43%. 31, your total housing expense cannot exceed the 31. Your total recurring obligations cannot exceed the 43. Excuse me. And then for VA, the way that we teach it in this class is just 43% across the board. You've got the one ratio. It just says total recurring obligations cannot exceed 43% under the VA loan ratios. So let me ask you a question. Some of this is going to reel back into last week's discussion on financing, but we still need to talk about it. True or false, the FHA will loan you money to purchase a home providing you can meet the minimum 3.5% down payment to meet their standards.
True. True.
True.
Well, I guess no, there's other factors too, but I mean, that is, yes,
Yeah.
like one of their standards, but it's not the only one.
It's one of the factors.
I'm changing my answer to false.
I think they show loans, right?
They don't loan it. They don't loan money. Now that you highlighted that. Oh, I was like, wait, they don't loan money.
The FHA will back your loan for the lender to loan you money so long as you meet their criteria and put the 3.5% down. Folks, words matter. So they do not lend the money directly. They provide these government subsidized insurances to help protect the bank for lending you money on such a low down payment loan. There you go. How about this? Let me get my clicker here. Which of these is an allowable advertisement based on Regulation Z? In other words,
Number two.
yeah, I was going to say, in other words, which of these is not a trigger term?
Oh,
2. Remember, specific numbers that have nothing to do with your loan costs are okay. $2,000 in closing costs paid by the seller, that has nothing to do with the loan. That's just a fact. Monthly payments as low as $800, that's a trigger term. Own your dream home for $3,000 down, that's a trigger term. Remember, TILA, Regulation Z, deals with trigger terms. Anytime that you state any of the financing terms with specific numbers, it triggers the need for more disclosures. Tell us more about the actual cost of this. That is TILA in Regulation Z. Then remember, RESPA is Regulation X. Also, I just want you to know, I just had an epiphany as I was sitting here. My clicker is in my briefcase bag. I just realized that the class I taught this morning, we went over contracts the whole day, so I never even used my slides, so that's why I didn't realize I had the clicker. I'm like, where could it be? And then it just remembered that I taught in person on Saturday. So it went with me, and it's with my other laptop. Just didn't want y'all to panic, okay? I just wanted y'all to feel better about this missing clicker. I know y'all are very distraught, just as I was. I know. But I know where it is, and so after our first break, I will have clicker in hand. I know exactly where it is now. It's good. Should probably order a second clicker now that I'm teaching some in-person classes. Wah. So, that is Unit 15 in a very condensed nutshell. Blanket mortgage, folks. What was a blanket mortgage?
A lot of like I'm thinking of blank a lot of pieces.
Like when a person buys lots in a subdivision, they get a blanket mortgage to cover more area. I don't know the exact word.
Yeah. No. Y'all need.
property.
I love that some of y'all, like, it looked like y'all were doing the thing that I did where you're like, throw a blanket over your living room. And I'm like, yeah. I equated it to throwing a blanket in your living room and it's going to land on multiple things. That is the one for multiple parcels of property. Very commonly utilized by builders or developers to get one loan to have multiple parcels that they are purchasing. That's a blanket mortgage. Not to be confused with a package loan, which is packaging personal property and real property simultaneously, like land in a manufactured home, or a house and all the furniture coming with it, or a house and a boat, or something like that. That's a package loan, okay? That's different. Blanket is multiple pieces of property. What you got, Jacob?
Just, I mean, you can finish.
You're good. Go ahead. It's
I was
just
curious
vocab.
Because I was looking at like all the units and stuff earlier today, and we're on unit 15. There are 23 units. Every unit's going to be on that test, right?
Yes, but as I've told you before, these are the biggest, most in-depth. The only other one that I'm really going to spend a lot of time on, valuations. The rest of them are going to be like, if you're lucky, 20 minutes a piece. If I'm being completely honest. Yeah. So, I mean, don't panic. A lot of this stuff too, like this next one, well, I'll tell you this when we get there. But yeah, you're going to be okay, I promise. So PMI, private mortgage insurance, that would go with a conventional loan if you have less than a 20% down payment. It's private because the loan is private, no government backing. Installment land contract, also called a contract for deed, land contract, land sales contract. Remember, the biggest thing I keep telling you is testable about the installment land contract is what?
that the buyer holds the equitable title,
And
the seller holds the
legal title.
legal title.
until you make your final payment.
Bam, there you go.
The legal title.
That is hands down the most testable part of that installment land contract. That's exactly right. Not to be confused with the other one parallel to it, the purchase money mortgage, which is where the seller transfers the legal title to the buyer at closing and takes back a note and a deed of trust just like the bank does. Okay, that is true seller financing, so don't confuse those. LTV is your loan to value ratio. They will give you the percentage of the purchase price or the appraised value, whichever is lower. Regulation Z is synonymous with which piece of legislation?
TILA.
TILA, the Truth in Lending Act. There you go. TILA specifically. TILA. RESPA is Regulation X, and then TRID is its own thing. Closing disclosure, folks, just for clarity in case you see it on the test, the settlement statement is a statement that shows all the costs at closing, okay? When we're dealing with a non-RESPA transaction, it's typically a HUD-1 settlement statement. When we're dealing with a RESPA transaction, the standardized form that they use is called the closing disclosure. That's what they have to give you at least 3 days prior to settlement, is a copy of this to review. It's called the closing disclosure. So HUD-1 and closing disclosure are both settlement statements that you would want to look at and review, but the closing disclosure is the one that meets the criteria of the TRID rule. It's just a very specific one that has additional information. What you got, Adriana?
So the closing disclosure needs to be delivered 3 days before the closing.
3 days prior to the settlement. Yep.
And the loan estimate?
3 days after loan application.
Oh, 3 days after the application. Okay.
Yep. 3 business days after loan application for the loan estimate. 3 days before closing for the closing disclosure under TRID. The TILA RESPA Integrated Disclosure Rule. Yep. And then ARM, remember ARM is an adjustable rate mortgage. Typically you get, brought in under this teaser rate. So they give you lower than the market average. Market average 6.7. They're going to give you like a 6.1 for like a year or two. And then they can start fluctuating based on the consumer price index. So there you go. Now, here's the deal, folks. This section right here, I'm going to be completely honest with you. Out of everything that we are going over, and of course, let me make a few statements here. When we had the 2023 syllabus, which you still have, and that's the one that we're kind of flowing off the teaching from. And then, of course, there's the new syllabus, which is really just grouping for, the way they've changed the testable topics for breaking it down for categories for review, for all intents and purposes. Let me explain something to you. If you look at the old syllabus, they allocated like 6 or 8 hours to teach this section, closing a real estate transaction. And in that time frame, where they said we would take 6 or 8 hours to teach you this stuff, there was 1, maybe 2 questions on that entire section. To put it in perspective, on the same syllabus, they would tell us to teach financing in 6 hours, and they were giving you like 16 questions. The math doesn't really math, does it? They allocated less time to teach financing for like 13 questions than they did for closing a real estate transaction, which was 2 questions. Now here's the deal. I'm going to just explain this section to you in a nutshell and help you understand the basics of this. And I'm going to be honest, I'm basically going to skip everything else in this section. because it's never really been that testable. Most of it's, just very matter of fact things that they could ask you questions on. And some of it is common sense. And I would much rather get to the harder stuff like valuations and fair housing with the time we have left versus something so trivial. Does that make sense for everybody? There have been times that I've spent 6 minutes on this section, and my students typically have a very high pass rate when they get to their state licensing exam. So unless they've just really changed the amount of questions in this section that make it into the new exam, it's not something we need to spend a whole lot of time on. So let me just give you this section in a nutshell, okay? It's called closing a real estate transaction. Well, we've already talked about TILA and RESPA, which is part of it. Of course, those criteria for the loan estimate and the closing disclosure and the list of items that are on there. We've already talked about some of the other pieces as well when we talked about the sales contract section, like the buyer's due diligence period, like, the settlement meeting where people sign things. The most testable part of this, hands down, is the ability to calculate prorations. That's it. And the ability to identify credits and debits on a closing disclosure. A lot of the other stuff is kind of common sense. So let me just explain something in a nutshell, okay? If I explain to you kind of how a transaction flows, I think you'll kind of get how this works. And here's a little visual just to kind of prove a point. There are a lot of steps that we have to go through between contract to closing. A lot of people think that our job is getting somebody under contract and yay, we get paid. Folks, our job really starts after we get them under contract. I mean, it really does. Yes, we have to drive around and show them houses. Yes, we have to negotiate that initial contract, but there is a lot. So let's just give you a quick rundown. If you are a buyer's agent, first you've got to go out and find buyers. Well, you've got to make sure that you don't violate any of the solicitation laws in doing that. After you find buyers, you will give them the working with real estate agents disclosure, and then you will ultimately form a relationship with those buyers. Really, they're working with your firm, but you are a subagent of your firm. So you will make appointments to go see homes that meet your buyer's needs. And you will take them to see these different houses, and after you find one that they like, it is in your fiduciary duties to help them negotiate the best deal possible. You put in offer after offer after offer until one gets accepted, and that involves basic contract law, moving from offer to contract. After you are under contract for a buyer, especially North Carolina, utilizing the offer to purchase and contract standard form 2T, we would start the buyer's due diligence period. That involves investigations, inspections, surveys, appraisals, making sure you can get your loan. So we're scheduling all these different things, orchestrating it all, making sure that we're negotiating any repairs that we see necessary, negotiating adjustments in contract price that we may be able to get based on things we discover through the due diligence period. As long as we have gotten through this due diligence period in a satisfactory manner, we will move past the due diligence period, which is now where the buyer's earnest money has gone hard, as they say, or live, or if they were to terminate, they would be in breach of contract. Remember, when you get past due diligence, it's now bilateral. So from due diligence ending through closing, it's just making sure that the paperwork gets delivered to all the parties, that if anything gets changed, we get copies to the attorney and the lender so that they can have the appropriate documentation. And of course, they will send us copies of that closing disclosure we were talking about. Now for TRID requires that the borrower receives it directly within 3 business days prior to closing. But we do get a copy because we review it. What are we looking for? We're making sure, well, of course, our commissions are correct. We're making sure that the prorations are correct. We're making sure that there's nothing on there that shouldn't be on there. We're making sure that the names are all spelled right, that the closing date is correct, and we're pushing back on anything that's incorrect. So most of this stuff, if you understand kind of the flow, is a little common sensey and a little self-explanatory, at least to the extent that you need to know it for pre-licensing. But after we review the closing disclosure for accuracy, the settlement meeting comes up. Settlement meeting is where the parties go to sign. Settlement and closing are not the same. So everybody goes to sign their respective documents. The seller is signing the deed to transfer. The buyer is signing the lending paperwork. After they sign it, it gets faxed back to the lender. then the lender will authorize disbursement and clear to close, or disbursement of funds, should I say, under the North Carolina Good Fund Settlement Act. And then the attorney will record the new deed in the name of the buyer, of course, the deed of trust, and then they will hand out all the money. That is when we're officially closed. When they hand out all the money under the North Carolina Good Fund Settlement Act. Folks, that's when we get paid. Everybody doesn't really understand that a lot. We do not get paid when we go and sit there with our clients at the table. We get paid after the fact. We have to wait for the new deed to be recorded, and then our firms get paid. Remember, the money goes to our firms, and then our firms pay us. This is true of every affiliated licensee. In North Carolina, if you're affiliated, the money goes to your firm, and then your firm pays us. Provisional brokers alike. In fact, in North Carolina, this is important, there is a rule that a provisional broker cannot be paid by anybody other than their broker in charge. So if you were doing a transaction as a provisional broker, and after you get done closing, your buyer says, you've done such a great job, here's a check for $6,000 as a bonus because we really appreciate everything you did. If you accept that as a provisional broker directly, you are in violation of license law in North Carolina. That money has to go to your firm. Now, the differentiation between a provisional broker and a full broker is a full broker who is not affiliated with a firm can be paid directly. But a full broker who is affiliated, same thing. All monies have to go through the firm and then make it to the broker from the firm.
One of our questions on, I don't remember which part.
Sure.
Was that a provisional broker could not accept the money, but if they did receive any monies that had to be given directly to the BIC, so they could not hand a provisional broker the check and then you hand it to the BIC. They have to hand it directly to the BIC.
No, I mean, depending on the context of the question, if you forward it over to the BIC, that's fine, right? Like, it's basically saying, like, if you get handed that check, you better not cash it. You would have to sign it over to your broker in charge. So just be careful of the context of the question. If the question is, can they be paid directly by other people? The answer is no. If the question is, did they do the right thing by signing it over to their BIC after it was handed to them immediately? Then yes, that's fine. We're not going to force somebody to rewrite the check, but they can sign it over to their firm, endorse it over to their firm. But hopefully, I mean, aside from that one example, we don't really trick you with that too much. So the biggest part of this is, of course, kind of understanding the flow of the transaction. And hands down, the credits and debits. And so what I mean is purchase price affects the buyer and the seller. And I want to show you something actually really quick, folks. You all have access to this, and I find this very helpful. Let me show you this. Here we go. So in your online platform with your textbook, you have the math packet under the math section, and that's where some of your homework excerpts were pulled from. But I want to show you a very valuable part for understanding what's testable in this section. Once upon a time, we had to do full closing disclosures on the test. You don't have to do that anymore, and in fact, you're down to only 7 math questions. But I want to show you what you need to know for this section especially. This proration math is very testable in regard to the closing a real estate transaction, and so you would need to know who's something goes a credit to, who does a debit to. It affects each party. So here's the other piece which is very helpful. If you look at the closing a sales transaction section, I may have already missed it. It's very early on. There we go. Look right here. A debit is an amount owed. We've taught you that. A credit is an amount received. And so you have to understand common buyer single entry items. Things that only affect the buyer. Loan amount is a credit. Earnest money, single entry buyer credit. Origination fee, single entry buyer debit. Discount point, single entry buyer debit. Appraisal fees, typically paid outside of closing. Credit report fees, typically paid outside of closing. Private mortgage insurance, both the annual premium and any escrows would be a debit. Attorney fees, debit. Title insurance, buyer debit. Recording fees, buyer debit. So there are certain things that are very much the buyer only, certain things that are the seller only, and certain things that are both. So the seller has way less single entries. Mortgage payoff, seller debit. Commission, typically seller debit. Deed prep, seller debit. Excise tax, seller debit. Then we've got double entry items that affect both. Purchase price. Due diligence fee. Prorated taxes, prorated rents, prorated HOA dues, dividing the bill between the two parties. This is hands down the most testable part of this section. So if you study this, it's going to help with this section. It's just understanding. And if you think about it logically, okay, wait, purchase price, does that affect the buyer, the seller, or both? Oh, the buyer has promised to pay it. So it's a buyer debit for the purchase price. Oh, the seller is going to get it. It's a seller credit for the purchase price. Oh, the loan amount. The seller doesn't care about the loan amount. Only the buyer cares about the loan amount. But the bank gave the buyer the loan, so that is a credit to the buyer. You can talk your way through most of these to figure them out. But this is a great place to kind of look at the information to help you prepare for any possible questions on this. Everybody with me?
That's from the homework, right?
Yeah, so if you go into your online portal and you go down into the real estate math section, there is the whole packet that you see right in front of me in there as a PDF download. And it's like page, what is this? 12. So the whole point of, contract to close, making sure that all the promises that we made are fulfilled, making sure that money gets transferred, deeds get recorded, making sure that all the information is accurate, making sure that all the things that were ordered get paid for. And so, as I said, we aren't actually getting paid. Nobody is getting paid until things are recorded, because that is when closing is happening. So, of course, recordation is defined as closing in North Carolina. Or closing is defined as recordation in North Carolina. Settlement is the meeting where all parties go and sign the documents. So the seller doesn't get their proceeds until it's recorded. The agents don't. The buyers, well, they're not making any money, but they don't own the house until it's recorded for all intents and purposes. Now, there's a lot of things that go into the due diligence process, but of course, they're not going to get very specific because we're not teaching you how to actually do a transaction in this class. One of the most testable things is, of course, making sure that your clients has the adequate insurance coverage. If we're doing a lease back, if, the buyer is purchasing a home in a floodplain, if, whatever it may be. So making sure that they have adequate insurance. None of the things like inspections are required. So don't get caught up on that. You're not required to have a home inspection, but it'd be really stupid not to, especially considering North Carolina is a doctrine of caveat emptor state. So, as I said, inspections, investigations, negotiations, surveys, appraisals, insurance being issued, everything in between. All this is part of the buyer's due diligence process. As I just mentioned 2 seconds ago, insurance is one of the more testable things within here. And that's why I'm kind of like breezing through this, folks. It's not going to be a crazy amount of this stuff. And most of it, like I said, it's kind of more common sense. If you just kind of slowly navigate it and think through what it's actually asking you, a lot of this can be figured out. So some of the other things we've talked about that goes into this: are there any tenants in place? Is it subject to the rights of tenants? Is it in violation of any zoning or ordinances? Is there any on-site septic? Is it being marketed as the appropriate number of bedrooms for the septic permit? As we talked about earlier in some of the land use control section, is there any environmental concerns on this property? Do we need any additional inspections for asbestos, for lead? Do we need the survey for these easements, these encroachments? These are all things we've talked about coming full circle into a transaction now. Now, let me ask you a question about the North Carolina Offer to Purchase and Contract Standard Form 2T. If a buyer was to get under contract using the standard form and they were to terminate during the due diligence period because they found foundation damage, what money would the buyer be entitled to get back?
Earnest money.
Earnest money only. So that's the reminder, folks. Due diligence, you pay that due diligence fee for the right to investigate the property. And during that time frame, time being of the essence, remember it runs through 5:00 p.m. on the date that you negotiated, you can terminate for any reason or no reason and be entitled to a refund of your earnest money deposit, but you have forfeit your due diligence fee. That's money you spent to have that right. Now, do not get caught up on the test of them saying something like the buyer and buyer's agent have negotiated $30,000 worth of repair with the seller, and then the buyer decides to terminate, which of the following is true. They're going to try to trick you into thinking it's a problem now for you to terminate during due diligence. It's not. You can always terminate during the due diligence for any reason or no reason, big, small, or otherwise, with no penalties, because you will just lose your due diligence money, but you knew that. You paid that for that reason. So we talked about the title search, the opinion of title back in the title transference section. Of course, that's where the attorneys do the title search, give the opinion of title. Title insurance policies get issued. Of course, earnest monies, any earnest monies would be handled appropriately. Folks, sometimes the escrow agent holding the earnest money is the real estate broker. Sometimes it's the closing attorney. If the closing attorney is holding it, then they will just disperse it as need be. If the firm is holding it, they can transfer it within 10 days of closing. They can't transfer it before then, but it is also extremely common if they're slated to get a commission check for them to not transfer it and just keep it, and then they would just use that and apply that towards the commission, and so it would kind of net out in that regard. So let's say that they were holding a $6,000 earnest money deposit and they were set to get a $12,000 commission, as opposed to sending them $6,000 to get sent back $12,000. They would keep the $6,000 and then they would net it out differently on the closing disclosure, and then they would just send them a check for $6,000. So then that way they would end up with a full $12,000. It's very common. Review of the settlement statement. That is a responsibility of the broker. Folks, the lenders review it. The attorneys review it. We are also responsible for reviewing it for accuracy and pointing out any issues or errors in the settlement statement. The settlement statement, also the closing disclosure, okay? Those are both types of settlement statements. The HUD one and the closing disclosure, both types of settlement statements. So the settlement statement is just a blanketed way of saying that. And of course, the whole point of a settlement statement, folks, if you were to look at it from a, actual point of view, let me show you a copy of this real quick. I think I have one pulled up. This is the closing disclosure. Now, this one's blank and not filled in, but this is what it looks like. And so it's got all these different line items that are plugged in for the borrower, for the seller. And the whole point of this form at the end of the day, which good news for you, you don't have to fill out one of these anymore in pre-licensing. You used to. At the end of the day, what they're determining is the cash to close from the borrower and the cash due to the seller typically. in theory, the buyer could be owed money back if they've already paid so much in connection of this. And so all that is the difference between all of the total buyer credits and the buyer debits. And then same thing with the seller, the total between all the seller credits and all the seller debits. And that would net out to tell you cash to close or how much you're walking away with. That's all a closing disclosure or settlement statement does. We've already talked about this. North Carolina utilizes attorneys for settlement agents, and we use a settlement meeting, which is a face-to-face meeting. It's not really face-to-face anymore, but all parties go to the actual attorney's office and sign. Of course, those lien theory company or lien theory states typically utilize title companies to handle the closing, and they're what we call escrow type closings or mail away closings. Nobody actually goes and meets together to sign the paperwork. You sign what you're supposed to sign in front of a notary, and you send it back, and then they kind of just disperse everything. So attorneys handle closing in North Carolina. A note that you could see in regard to NC is, of course, non-attorney agents, meaning paralegals, could handle the actual closing itself, where they instruct parties where to sign and where they collect and disperse monies. So a paralegal who's not an attorney could do that, but they couldn't do the title search. Let's talk about this for a second, because I'm going to, readjust the way that I might teach this. I might just throw it all into this little bit right here. When you make money from selling your house, that is reported by the attorney to the IRS, because it would be counted as non-employee income. You made money. And so the way that they look at that is what they call a capital gain. If you made money off the sale of your house, that's considered an investment. And just like stock options, it could be constituted as a capital gain. Now, the way that they look at it is a correlation between what you paid for the house and what you made from the house. And so there's a formula for it. And I will teach that later. But there is a capital gain exemption that says that if you have lived in the house as your primary residence for 2 out of the last 5 years, you do not have to pay taxes on up to $250,000 in gains as an individual or up to $500,000 in gains as a married couple. So you buy your house, live in it for 6 years. When you sell it, your capital gain is $200,000 and it's been your primary residence. You don't owe a dime in taxes because that is less than the $250,000 exemption. But the IRS, it still gets reported to the IRS. You would just claim it as an exemption when you filed your taxes. So that any monies you make gets reported to the IRS by the attorney. Of course, the attorney has to, cut checks to pay off all the liens, get the deed ready to transfer, any tax bills that need to be handled. All of that stuff gets handled by the attorney. What you got, Jacob?
Do you have to live in the property for 6 years?
Yes, primary residence. Has to be your primary residence for 2 out of the last 5 years. Now, those years do not have to be consecutive. But 2 out of the last 5 years, you have to be able to prove it was your primary residence. It's one of the coolest tax laws that exist. This is just, like I said, this is matter-of-fact stuff. I'm not spending a lot of time here. The closing is typically handled at the attorney's office. They review the documents. Everybody signs it. They get the final packet for the lender. Everything gets handled. They get the authorization to disperse funds, update the new deed, record it, all that jazz. Now, this is just for your own personal knowledge. I don't know if they're going to try to throw this on the test or not. Folks, I want you to understand the way that information transfers. Because if you think about it, there is a deed that exists at the Register of Deeds that says that the seller owns the property. But there's also a deed of trust that says that the bank has the right to that property. Now, we can't record the satisfaction of the seller's deed of trust until the seller makes money and pays the bank back. So in reality, what happens is it's kind of backdated. The seller signs over their ownership to the new buyer. The buyer signs over their ownership to their new lender. And then the attorney will send a check to that other lien holder, the seller's lien holder. And so the satisfaction isn't typically recorded until sometimes a month or so after closing. But because it does get recorded, that means that everything is on the up and up in the Register of Deeds. Everything's fine. Because we know that they no longer have any right to that property because it did get recorded. So, how about this? When do the seller and the real estate brokers get paid for the transaction?
After closing, after everything.
Closing.
After closing, and what do we call closing? How do we define closing?
When it's been recorded.
There you go. Closing, aka once everything has been recorded. Y'all go take a break. Come back at 7:25. Whoop whoop. I asked you a question before we went on break. I'm really not. I'm gonna look through and see. I already talked about Regulation X and limiting escrow reserves. We don't need to settlement costs. Sure. Yep. See, the same things. We've already talked about this. I will throw this into the mix, not because I think it's crazy testable, but just because. I told you that closing disclosure has to be given within 3 days of the effective date. I'm sorry, for 3 days of the effective date. Has to be given 3 business days prior to settlement. Okay, the closing disclosure has to be given 3 business days prior to settlement. Now, there are certain things that, if they occur, would trigger the need for a new closing disclosure and a new 3-day period. And so, if the rate was to change by more than 1/8% on a fixed rate loan, or 1/4% on a variable rate or adjustable rate loan, and that can happen if your credit score goes down in the midst of something happening throughout that. If they add a prepayment penalty, that would change that you would need a new closing disclosure and a new 3-day period. And then, of course, if the basic loan product changes, meaning sometimes you have to switch because of ratios from like a conventional to an FHA in the middle of the transaction. So it is possible for that to happen. So if you do that kind of switch, that would require a new closing disclosure and a new 3-day period if the other one had already happened. So a couple things could affect that and cause a new closing disclosure and a new 3-day period to happen. So, how about this question? This is due to the borrower within 3 days of loan application.
Loan estimate.
Loan estimate. The next one, this is due to the borrower 3 days before settlement. It says 6 days of snail mail, but the 3 business days prior to settlement, what are we looking for here?
Closing disclosure.
Closing disclosure. Closing disclosure. These are all things I've said before. North Carolina, you have to be able to review the closing disclosure for accuracy. Be careful, though. You're not responsible for all items on there. You are only responsible for things that you would actually be able to know, like prorated cost, commission cost, any agreed upon credits between seller and buyer. You wouldn't be expected to calculate loan costs or anything like that, the discount points, origination fees, because that's between the buyer or the borrower and the lender. Of course, this next little note here on the next slide deals with mistakes. Folks, if you catch a mistake, you have an obligation to disclose it. Otherwise, that could constitute a misrepresentation or negligence on your part. So pretty straightforward. Like I said, a lot of this stuff, if you analyze the questions, they're sometimes self-explanatory, as long as you just read the question carefully and kind of flow what they're trying to discuss here. Now, as I told you, the biggest part of this is, of course, understanding the credits and the debits. Debits are we take money from you, credits if we give money to you, and, of course, the cost associated with the respective parties. And I'm going to leave it at that so we can kind of move into the next thing. I don't think there's anything else. And you have these slides, so... I've already talked about prorations. Let's see. Nah, we're good. I will let you answer this, though, to see how you're feeling. How would the due diligence fees appear on the closing statement?
As a credit for the seller.
Seller credit.
Let me ask you this. When does the due diligence fee get paid?
As soon as you sign the contract.
When you put an offer.
Got to be careful because y'all were toting on it, but you're not using the right verbiage. Signing is not enough. Putting in an offer is not enough. It's when the offer becomes...
Communicated.
There you go. When it becomes a contract, right? The second you have a contract, the due diligence fee is paid to whom?
Due diligence is to the seller.
The seller. Now understand that happens the day we get under contract. So you just told me that we're going to be giving the seller more due diligence money on the closing date?
No.
No. So I'll ask you again, how does due diligence appear on a closing disclosure, do you think?
Credit to the buyer.
Credit to the buyer, but you can't manifest money out of thin air, so it would be a what to the seller?
Debit.
Debit to the seller. Everybody understand that? You get the money back at closing, and so the seller already has it. And so as long as you go to closing, the buyer gets the money back. So due diligence is a credit to the buyer, debit to the seller. Taking money from the seller and reimbursing the buyer. Robbing Peter to pay Paul. Due diligence is a double entry item because the buyer gets their money back as long as they go to closing. That makes sense. You got to think about the timing here, right? You paid it when you got under contract. This is 45 days later and you're actually closing on the house. So how about the earnest money? How would earnest money appear on the closing statement?
Credit to the buyer.
Credit to the buyer. It is a single entry buyer credit because the escrow agent says, here, I've been holding this for you. Take it back. So the seller never touches the earnest money unless what?
Unless you default.
The buyer.
There you go. Yeah, unless the buyer breaches contract, which means they terminated after the due diligence period. So it never was actually the seller's money. It was just sitting there in case the buyer screwed up. As, what do we call that type of damage when we've pre-negotiated an amount that you get if we screw up?
Liquidated.
Liquidated damages. There you go. Now, I will throw this one into the mix just because I want you to make sure that you're comfortable with this math. And of course, this one's a little more difficult. So let's talk about this, folks. Loan costs are always a buyer debit. Loan origination fee, discount points, interim interest is a buyer debit. And so this is one where students get really confused. Why? Because when we're prorating things like taxes, and rents and HOA dues, seller gets a portion, buyer gets a portion. And the default is the seller owns the day of closing. Well, this is a loan thing, and so this doesn't have anything to do with the buyer. I'm sorry, the seller, Lord. Doesn't have anything to do with the seller. So let me explain this question to you and make sure that you're following along with me here. This says, compute the interim interest due to the lender for a March 27th closing. Sales price is $260,000. 80% loan to value ratio with a 4.5% interest rate. Well, folks, this is going, let's just default to the 360-day method because I told you you could be tested on both, but if we don't tell you otherwise, it's going to be the 360-day method. Okay? And so when did the bank lend you money? Look at this and tell me, when did the bank lend you the money?
It would be March 27th, right?
Correct. The day of closing, they're going to lend you money on March 27th. Now, when will your first mortgage payment be?
May.
May. So when you pay your first payment in May, you're actually paying for April's interest. What that means is they lent you money on March 27th. Oops. Don't judge me. It's been a long day. They lend you money on March 27th, but they're not collecting the interest for March anywhere in your amortization schedule. So your interim interest is what we call prepaid interest. They say there's no other place for us to collect this, so we're going to collect it at closing. So you start paying interest the day you borrow it, and interim interest runs through the end of the month. Now, if we're doing a 360-day year, that means there are 30 days in March. So the easiest way to calculate the days of interest is the days in the month, 30, minus the date of closing, 27, plus 1. This is the only time you will ever do this plus one thing. Because if you're dealing with taxes, rents, and HOA dues, one of them has the day of closing and everybody else starts the day after. But this is the buyer having to pay interest the day of closing, the day after, the next day, all the way through the end of the month. So if you don't believe me, interest for the 27th, the 28th, the 29th, the 30th, if we're saying the 30-day month method. 4 days of interest that you're having to pay the bank. So we'll call it 4 days because it is. And the way that you calculate this, folks, is remember, they can't charge you interest on money that you didn't borrow. Well, you're only borrowing 80% of the purchase price. So you would take your $260,000 purchase price times your loan to value ratio of 80%. So your loan amount is $208,000. So that's your principal balance as of right now. Multiply that by your interest rate of 4.5%. And that gives you your annual interest. What you got, Jacob?
I'm sorry, this is a slightly off-topic question.
Then don't ask it.
Okay.
I'm kidding. Like, I mean, is it like really off topic or is it mildly off topic?
I mean, it's off-topic, but it's an important question.
Ask it and then I may say, hold on.
Do I need to go buy a calculator, or on the test, is there a calculator worked into it where I do it on my screen?
I would suggest buying one so you can get very familiar with it. I can allow you to use your calculator that is built into your screen, like on your computer, but that gets very cumbersome to use during the test. So I would suggest buying a $5 one from like Dollar General or something. Yeah. So, folks, when you calculate your interest, that is your annual interest, your principal balance times your interest rate. If you were calculating simple interest, you're done. But we're not calculating simple interest, we're calculating interim interest. Are you about to pay them a year's worth of interest at closing?
No.
No. How much interest are you paying them? How many days worth?
4.
4 days. So we need to figure out how much interest you would owe them per day. Now remember I told you we're doing currently off of the 360-year, 30-day month methodology. So you would take your annual interest, divide it by 360 to give your per diem, how much interest you would owe per day, $26 a day times your 4 days. So the interim interest would be a $104 buyer debit in this scenario. So everybody understand what I just did there? It's a pain in the butt. You got to practice it because it's not something that you typically thought of in your personal life, except for Stephanie. And then, I'm kidding. And so you just got to make sure you understand that it's the loan amount and all these different things and the way that you have to add that extra day in. What you got, Sam?
Can you hear my volume today?
Yep. Oh, yeah.
So I'm just confused why your first payment would be in May instead of April.
So I'm going to be completely honest with you. When you're dealing with mortgages, they are paid in arrears. And so the way that works is the banks just anticipate that your payment is going to pay for the previous month. And so they really only want a payment that already includes a whole month because that's how amortization is based off of. Full months of payment schedules. But here's the thing. Believe it or not, there is a way, and this is real world versus testable. With something like this, it doesn't make sense to make you bring, $30,000 to closing and then to turn around and make a $1,700 payment, like 3 days later. That would be cruel. And so they do it too to kind of give you a month to recuperate from all the money that you just paid. But in the real world, Sam, understand that it is possible that if you're closing really early in the month to do something like March 2nd, as your closing, you could elect to make an April payment. And what they'll actually end up doing is giving you money at closing, because basically there's, you're going to pay them the full month of interest in April, but they didn't need the full month, so they will actually give you money at closing. So if you're ever buying a house, you can actually talk to your lender. It's up to you which one you want to do. Most people like to skip the month because it gives them time to recuperate, and mortgages are designed to be paid in arrears anyway. Yeah. Good question.
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah, what you got?
If I close a house on May 1st, like you said, then mortgage not going to be due until July 1st?
May, June, July. If it's you at that point, you would just have to talk to your lender, because the lender may try to do it on June, as I just said, and give you a credit. So you would just, at that point, you can talk to the lender and you can pick. But understand the problem. This was $104 for 4 months worth of interest. I want you to picture if you're closing May 1st, and we had $26 a day, 26 times 30, that's a lot more. And realistically, this is a very small amount. In today's day and age, some people would end up paying $3,000 in additional closing costs, which is why some people don't want to skip a month, because that means they have to pay so much closing costs at closing for that interest. So you would just talk to your lender on, is your payment going to be the next month, or is it going to be the month after, if you're closing towards the beginning of the month?
Okay.
Yeah, both are possible in the real world. It just depends. So here's a buckle up buttercups kind of moment. Let me explain why. Folks, I hate this section. I'll tell you why I hate this section. There are so many abstract things in here that you've never heard of, that are way outside of the wheelhouse of a real estate broker, and there is just so many levels to it. It used to be that I hate this section, and it was important to know this section, but there were not a crazy amount of questions on the section. For the life of me, I'm kind of nervous, because on the new test, it looks like there are like 10 questions from this section. Historically, there were like 3. And this section sucks. I mean, it's hard. That's a pep talk. I know. It's not fun. It's not good. I don't like it. So in your studies, I would spend more time in this section, because even as I explain it to you, you're going to have those. I know it was not a good pep talk. That's why I'm not a motivational speaker. I'm an instructor. Okay. Let's just be honest about it. Even if I explain every single thing that you need to know on the test, there's no chance that you retain more than 60% of what I'm about to tell you, because you've just never heard it before. And it's just such an odd thing. I'll try to make it better, but it's rough. So let's kick it off, okay? Real property valuations. Folks, why is this important? And I told you real estate is a multi-trillion-dollar industry. And of course, a part of it is the lending. Well, we just talked about the lending through the financing. But of course, one of the biggest components of the lending was somebody telling the banks what the home is worth. Because the banks aren't your friends. The banks only lend you money because they have your home as collateral through that security instrument, the deed of trust or the mortgage. And so what this means is we need people and methodologies to determine how much a property is worth. Valuation, value. Now here's the crazy part of this section. Some of the time I'm going to be talking about an appraiser. Some of the time I'm going to be talking about a broker. Don't freak out. You'll understand the differentiation, but the reason why is because we use very similar methodologies to determine probable sales price or probable list price as an appraiser uses to determine a probable opinion of value. So we've got to talk about the different approaches to value. We've got to talk about some of the mathematical components. We've got to talk about the difference between appraisers, real estate brokers, and everything in between. And as I said, it's cruel and unusual to add more questions, in my opinion, to this section, but it looks like they did. Now, I can't swear to you, because all they said is, there's this many questions from this section, but the section's also kind of grouped interestingly. So, Let's just start with some terminology here. Everybody has heard the word appraiser before. Everybody has heard the word appraisal before. This is not the part that is abstract. And so understand that just like all of you are working through a program to get a real estate broker's license, an appraiser has to work through a program to become an appraiser. So it is a licensed job. They do have to apply through an appraisal board, just like we have a real estate commission. They do have standards of practice. Now here's the very important differentiation. When you buy a house, the bank will force you to order an appraisal, which is where a licensed appraiser goes out, evaluates the property using standards of practice to determine, in their opinion, a probable sales price. Folks, it is just that. It's an opinion, but it's an educated opinion using standards of practice. Now, it is really and truthfully the opinion of value on that day. Now, does that mean that it's not good for your transaction? No, of course it is. But it is only good for that day because we all realize if an appraiser came out and said, well, this is worth $400,000. And then the market tanked and everybody lost their jobs and nobody could sell anymore, it's no longer worth that. So it's an opinion of value as given by a licensed appraiser at that date and time. Now, here's the important piece. Value is a word that only an appraiser can use. As real estate brokers, when we get phone calls from sellers and they say, come tell me what my house is worth. That's what they always ask us. How much is my house worth? Realistically, we're not allowed to answer that. That's what they want to know, and we're going to give them an answer, but we are going to clarify that we don't have the ability to use the word value. Only an appraiser can do that. So what do we utilize as real estate brokers? We'd use the term probable sales price or probable list price. So we will go out and we will use a standard of practice very similar to what an appraiser uses. And so let me explain something that you're looking at on the screen here. There is the CMA and there is a BPO. CMA stands for Comparative Market Analysis. BPO stands for Broker Price Opinion. Now, I will tell you that if you were to look at the real estate manual in North Carolina, they give the exact same definition for these two things. I will tell you that the context that we use them in is typically the only differentiation. So a CMA is a comparative market analysis, and it is where a real estate broker uses a standard of practice called the sales comparison approach to determine a probable sales price of a piece of real estate. Well, a BPO is the exact same thing. Here's the context differentiation. We typically call it a CMA when we are doing it for a client as part of listing or helping them buy a house. We would typically call it a broker price opinion when we're doing it for a third party and getting paid to do it. So let me give you kind of a backstory on the BPO. Once upon a time, the banks would pick up the phone and they would call real estate brokers and they would say, hey, I'll give you $200 if you do a broker price opinion on this property and tell me what we could probably sell it for. And so the broker would do it, determine a probable sales price, give it to the bank, and the bank would pay the broker. And then the broker would say, well, why'd you need to know that? And the bank's going to say, mind your business. Here's your money, go away. And what they were doing is they were trying to figure out what they could sell it for to determine whether or not they wanted to foreclose on a homeowner that was not making their payments. And so that's the difference. They are both figuring out a probable sales price using the same standard of practice. But the context is we typically call it a BPO if it's done for a customer or a third party like a bank for a fee. And we call it a CMA if we're doing it for a client as part of our duties as a listing agent or a buyer's agent. That's the only differentiation. Now, please be aware that in North Carolina, a provisional broker is prohibited from doing a BPO for a fee. But a provisional broker can do a CMA for a client. The problem is getting paid a fee directly for doing it. Now, I don't know if they're going to try to trip you up on the North Carolina test, but if they ever try to trick you and say, can a provisional broker do a CMA in exchange for a fee? The answer is still no, because they're still trying to trick you. The key is they can't do it for a fee. They can do it as part of their services to their clients. A full broker can do a BPO for a fee, and a BIC sure can. But a provisional broker cannot do a BPO for a fee. What you got, Adriana?
So the provisional broker could do the CMA
Yes.
without being paid, right?
Correct. As part of their duties to their clients.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
CMA for your so, and you understand, folks, you would do a CMA for both buyers and sellers. You do a CMA for the sellers to determine what a probable list price is. You do one for a buyer to make sure that they're paying the right price.
Now I got a question. A CMA from a broker or BPO, whatever we want to call it at that time, versus an appraiser doing it. Which one holds the highest weight?
An appraiser.
Appraiser, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Understand that a CMA or a BPO is only to help us determine what we should offer or what we should list it as. It will never be utilized for lending with a bank. It does not have that much power. Only an appraiser can. So a bank will never call us. In that example I gave you, the bank called us because they were going to foreclose, not to lend people money. They will only utilize an appraisal to determine what they were willing to lend somebody. Ours are just matter of fact for clients and third parties who want to know. So you'll kind of see the correlation between the two, but of course the verbiage is very specific. Appraiser can give an opinion of value. We can give a probable sales price. Big difference. Very similar methodologies, but different. Now, we talked about value very early on in this class, and so we talked about the characteristics of value, and the acronym we utilized was DUST. Demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. Supply and demand curves are obviously part of this, and so the greater demand for something, the more valuable it is. The less demand for something, the less valuable it is. So demand increases value. Utility, can you use it? Does it satisfy the needs? If you are looking for a house and there is a house for sale, it satisfies the needs. That beats your utility. If there is raw land versus a house, the house, which solves more needs, is worth more versus the raw land that you would have to build on. Scarcity, the less of something there is, the more valuable. Once again, economics 101. And then transferability. Folks, if I gave you a piece of land and I said you can never give it to anybody else, it has utility, but it has no value. You need to be able to sell it in order to have value. So these are just different economic or characteristics of value or economic characteristics of a piece of real property. And so the acronym is DUST. Now, as I just mentioned when Tim and I were discussing this, you can never utilize a CMA or a BPO in place of an appraisal. They are not the same thing. We only do them for our clients as part of our job, as part of, if somebody hires us, but it's not powerful enough to be an appraiser or an appraisal. Now, do understand the most common time that appraisers are hired is when somebody is buying a piece of real property and the banks want to know the value. But realistically, there is nothing stopping a seller from calling an appraiser today and getting an appraisal done on their property. But it's not part of a loan, and so they will not even use it as a consideration for a loan unless it was ordered specifically for that purpose. What you got, Adriana?
So, I think you said on one of the government-backed loans that they utilize for the loan amount to be the appraisal or the sales price, which is
Lower.
Answer? Yes. So in this, if the seller got a buyer that is using one of these government-backed loans, even if they have an appraisal that is higher than, the price that they were having on the CMA or the BPO, would they feel pressure to lower the price from the appraisal in order to the bank to accept? Would they consider doing that, or they just say next? Sorry, I don't know if it's confused.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand what the exact question is here. Let me make a statement and let's see if this answers your question. The banks don't care what our CMA is in any way, shape, and form. The appraiser uses their own standards of practice to determine the value. And if that comes back higher or lower, the only reason that matters is because if it comes back higher, they will give you the loan to value ratio on the purchase price. If the appraisal comes back lower than purchase price, they will only give you the loan to value ratio on the lower appraised value, which means if you want to buy it, you would have to bring more money out of pocket as a down payment in that regard.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they don't consider our CMA at all. And they don't make adjustments at all if it comes back higher. They're not going to lend you more. They're just going to lend you the purchase price if it comes back higher.
Yes. My question was, if the seller, if like the market is tough and they have this seller that they have the government-backed loan and
you keep saying the government-backed loan. Let me just point, that doesn't change anything in this regard. There are more strict appraisal criteria, meaning certain repair things like that need to happen, certain conditions of the property, but keep going.
I was just curious if the sellers would have this pressure of lowering the price just to be accepted for that kind of lenders.
No, it wouldn't be the price that would be the restriction. It would be the condition of the property. That's the only thing that differentiates it, because, an appraisal should determine the same value across the board, hopefully. But for example, FHA loans will not lend on a house that needs repairs. If siding is cracked, if siding is broken. And so if a seller wanted to be enticing to more loan types, they would do more repairs than they would lower the price.
Okay.
There you go. Yeah. So let's talk about some terminology here. Market value, folks, is determined by an appraiser. It is basically what we say. An appraiser looks at the property and they say, okay, in an open and competitive market with competent parties, what would a property probably sell for? That's what an appraisal says. And that determines the market value. So if you see market value on the test, it's the appraisal amount. Okay? What an appraiser thinks the property would get in an open and competitive market with competent parties, meaning not idiots knowing what they're doing, and the market is not, shifted in any kind of way, shape, or form. That is market value. So market value, quite literally, is the appraised value. Now let me explain why this can get confusing. There are other terminologies that come into play, like market price. When I say market price, it's what a home actually sold for. And let me explain how these can be different. If I was to hire an appraiser to come in and appraise my home, and they said, Seth, your house is worth $420,000. And then Tom Cruise comes up to me that same day and says, I want this house. I'll give you $1.2 million for it. My house is not worth $1.2 million, but some idiot named Tom Cruise was willing to pay me that much for it. And you best believe he can have it. Okay, with everything inside. You want the cat, the dogs, the kids? What you want? I'm going to leave it all? Okay, great. I'm kidding. Not the kids. They can have everything else, though. Not the kids. It's a joke. Lord. So market price is what it actually sold for. Now, of course, depending on the context of the question, there is the old market price, what it sold for before, and there is a new market price, what it will sell for again. Market price is not a constant. So whatever it sells for is called the market price. Now, let me introduce one more differentiation. Folks, if you were to call right now and look at installing an in-ground pool at your house, I hate to break it to you, the best deal you're probably going to get in today's day and age is around 60 grand for a nice in-ground pool. That's a chunk of change, isn't it? Now, here's my question to you. If you pay 60 grand for an in-ground pool, has it increased the value of your property by 60 grand?
No.
No. That is what we call market cost. Just because something costs you a certain amount does not mean it increased your value a certain amount. So that means if you spend $30,000 on a kitchen renovation, there is no tit for tat. Your house is now worth $30,000 more. It doesn't work that way. The return on your investment for most things like that, around 30% on average, depending. And so your $60,000 pool increases your value by about $15,000 of that. Your kitchen renovation, maybe more like $20,000. It's market cost is what you paid for it. It's not the same thing as what it is worth to the general public. So the reason why that's important as a real estate agent, sometimes we have to overcome this. You sit down with the seller and they say, well, I added this, I added this, I added this, it cost me this, it cost me that. And they think that they can just take that plus appreciation, add it in, and that's how you get the value of their house. Doesn't work that way. Our biggest rebuttal as a real estate agent, well, did you enjoy those things? And they say, well, yeah. And I said, well, great, because that's the value you got out of it was your enjoyment. We can only sell it for what the public's willing to pay for it. The market value and the market price. So market cost is what it actually costs you for the house, what it actually costs you for the renovation, the pool, the feature. Now, of course, when we're dealing with values, there's a lot of different factors outside of that dust that can sway values in a given area. Believe it or not, folks, there is social forces. How much infrastructure is out there? Is it a desirable area to be, right? Economic, political, physical. A lot of us don't think about this. But if you look at maps for like the Republican and Democrat and all these areas, there's like pockets, right? There's areas where people kind of like, oh, this area is, definitely more left. This area is definitely more right. And then, of course, there are politicians in those local areas that people like or don't like. There's tax policies. Do they have jobs? Do they not have jobs? Is there, infrastructure? All of these different things actually do play into value. So people who don't like paying a lot of taxes will a lot of times move to areas where there is no income tax. Other people, move to areas where, there's no sales tax. There's people who align more with their beliefs. All of these play a factor in your value of their property. So I'll give you, the visual that kind of coincides with this. Okay, so don't think this is social, economic, political, and physical. So social forces, how many people are getting married? How many people have kids? How many people have families? Are there, things to do for families? Is it widely received? Is it more of a metropolis for single people? Is it, whatever it may be? Economic, of course, is there good employment rates? Is there high-paying jobs compared to the cost of living? Are you going to be broke your whole life? Is there going to be an uphill battle to get a job? Are they growing on a steady pace? Is it in a depreciative state? So social forces, economic forces. And then, as I said, political and physical forces. Political, zoning, taxes, land use controls, legislation, medical coverage, anything like that. Physical forces, of course, general topography, size, shape, climate. Florida versus Maine, California versus Colorado, public transport versus highways, overcrowded versus not. A lot of different things come into play there. So, let me ask you a question. True or false? Real estate agents use a comparative market analysis to determine the probable market value of real property.
False. False, yeah.
False. Why?
Not true.
Because we don't determine the market value.
There you go. Value is not a word we can use. We determine the probable sales price. Probable sales price. Yeah, I got to be careful. We use it to determine a probable sales price or a probable list price. That's what we can do with a CMA or BPO. Now, some of these other things we've talked about earlier as well. Highest and best use came up in the beginning slides. Of course, it's the concept that something is being utilized for its biggest return on its investment at any given time, and it can change. Now, I have slides for all these. So substitution, supply and demand, conformity, anticipation, contribution, competition, and change. All of these are what we call basic economic principles of value. And so this is a little more in depth than the flashcard level with the financing slides. You will need to be able to know when these are utilized for in some context. And so I'll explain what I mean in just a second. So they're on the slides in just a second. And you got a copy of these, so don't come at me. Highest and best use, I told you, is being utilized for its best return at any given moment. But I want to talk about substitution, okay? Substitution is this principle when you are faced with two equal things, you are going to pick the one that is cheaper. That's what you're going to do. And so, let me explain. From a house point of view, if you just needed a house that was 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms in a certain zip code, and there was one that was $200,000 and one that was $2 million, the general principle states that we're going to go for the one that's $200,000. If they satisfy the same need, we're going to go for the cheaper one. Let me give you a real world kind of example of this that's not necessarily cheaper, but a convenience thing. Have you ever drive through a fast food restaurant and you order a Coke? And say, is Pepsi okay? There are some people in this world that's like, fine, because the convenience, it's going to drink the same even though you don't like it. But there are other people who that's not their main goal. Their main goal was to get exactly what they wanted. And so substitution doesn't fall on those people. So same kind of concept. If all things were equal, people will go for the one that costs less if all things were equal. That is the principle of substitution. Now, understand that this is a method that we use for the comparative market analysis that we're going to talk about in a moment. What do I mean? We basically look at houses and we pretend they're identical. And so we basically say, okay, well, if this was identical, what would it probably have been worth? So we kind of take a look at the features and we make adjustments. And so we're saying if equal, what would the value be? And then we use that principle to help us determine what a different property should be valued at. Now, I'll explain that more when we get there, but go take a break. Come back at 8:40. So we are having fun-filled conversations in the valuation chapter. And of course, we were talking about some economic principles of value. And so substitution, as I said, is if all things are equal and they satisfy the same utility, people will under most circumstances, pick the cheaper option. And we'll explain a little bit more when we get into CMAs in just a second. Of course, as I keep referring to Economics 101, that rolls back into what we call supply and demand, and more specifically, supply and demand curves. Supply and demand states that the more of something there is, the less valuable it is. The less of something there is, the more valuable it is. This is very true of all things. You know, this is why if we have a famine of a crop one year and, you know, there's a lot less of it, say like corn, the cost of corn oil goes up, the cost of corn in general, the cost of all the, you know, same thing as diamonds. Diamonds have this illusion of being scarce, and so of course they're more valuable. So supply and demand. Conformity, folks, is a very interesting concept. Conformity says that you actually maximize the value of a property by being similar to everything else around you. Let me give you an example. If you were to build a $6 million mansion in the middle of a very moderate single-family detached neighborhood where most average prices are $400,000, you will be priced out of the neighborhood. That basically what will happen is it will not be as desirable because it doesn't fit in. Same thing is true of like the lowest end. So you want to be kind of even keel. I'll give you a real world example of this. My dad lives in a very normal, middle of the ground neighborhood that has been around for a while. And most of them you would consider, starter homes, I guess, smaller homes, because that's just what they are. And so basically every home in the neighborhood does not have a garage. It just wasn't a part of that neighborhood style at the time that it was built. So my dad talked about adding a 2-car garage to it, and I said, don't. He said, why? I said, because you'll be one of 2 houses in the garage, and so you'll be overpriced. You will not see the maximum return on your investment by being the nicest house in the neighborhood. You get the biggest return by being similar to everything else. Manufactured home, wouldn't do as well in an area where it's surrounded by all these other houses. So believe it or not, it is actually a bigger result of your value, or you kind of realize it better by kind of fitting into the rest of the neighborhood as opposed to way overbeating it or way underperforming. Anticipation is the next one. Of course, you all are familiar with the term anticipation. Well, anticipation is basically this premise of what is going to happen, so let me act on it now. And so anticipation can be good or bad. So everybody was talking about Apple coming into RTP, and so the anticipation of something like that coming could go ahead and prematurely raise prices because people are trying to buy before it comes into the area. That would be anticipation. Or, of course, something shutting down or a highway coming into an area could cause a negative anticipation where, they're going to take all these houses by eminent domain, let's sell now, and then too many people try to sell, and then it creates too much competition. And, of course, competition can be ruinous in that regard. So, anticipation is acting on what you think may occur. Contribution is this principle, and of course contribution kind of comes into play with a comparative market analysis as well. It's the principle of what having something adds in value or lacking it takes away in value. And so if we say, okay, these 2 homes are equal except this one has a fireplace, this fireplace contributed an additional $1,400 in value. Or this one had a 2-car garage, this one didn't. This one that had a 2-car garage, that contributed an additional $30,000. Or the lack of having one took away about $30,000. So that is the principle of contribution. What a specific feature adds or takes away from a given property. So anticipation and contribution. Next couple, competition and change. Now, competition, you all are familiar with that term as well. This exists in everything. Competition could be good or bad, but of course, too much competition typically ends up being a bad thing. And so let me give you a couple examples here. If you list your house and you only have 1 or 2 competitors, it could help increase values because there's only a couple good properties for sale. If there's 600 houses like yours that are hitting the market at the exact same time, that is too much competition, and that can ruin the value of your property because there's a surplus yet again, creating too much competition. Another example would be the way the Airbnbs have happened. And so a lot of people have heard that Airbnbs are making people money hand over fist because we're all stupid and we like pretty houses and we'll pay money for them. And so people are going out and buying Airbnbs in a lot of different markets. Well, that is creating negative competition for the general public because homeowners can no longer buy houses because the Airbnbs are buying them. They're becoming oversaturated, and because there's so many other Airbnbs, they're all losing money. So competition, big contributing factor here. And then, of course, the only thing that is absolutely constant is change. Change is always going to be present. Good, bad, up, down, cyclical, not cyclical, stability, decline, recession, growth, appreciation, all of the above. If you actually were to Google real estate cycles, there is a graph that shows you that it is very cyclical. It typically goes up, declines, levels out, goes up, declines, level out. And it historically has. Now, we have had some anomalies over the past decade. They kind of make it look a little crazy, but the overall trend still exists. And so, yes, change is a constant, and change is a contributing factor to economics, especially within the real estate industry. So, as we continue this thought, this next section is probably going to be the most testable section within this whole valuations chapter. It's all testable, but the most testable is going to be the next thing that we're going to get into. And that is those approaches to value that we outlined in the objectives within this section, okay? And so we've got 3 main approaches to value. Now, folks, don't freak out here because I'm using the word value. Well, yeah, these are all processes that an appraiser uses. So we call it an approach to value. Of course, you will see in just a second that when I talk about real estate brokers, we actually use these approaches as well. So that's why I keep saying we both use standards of practice, and we use a similar standard of practice to the appraiser, but we can't call it the same thing as they can. Ours has a different name, and it's a probable sales price. Theirs is, in fact, an opinion of value. So we've got the sales comparison approach, the cost approach, and the income capitalization approach. Now, I'll give you the slides for these in a second. But if we start with this sales comparison approach, I want you to look at those words. Sales comparison. We look at past sales and compare them to our, what we call subject property. So in other words, we've got a home. Let's say it's a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom home. And we want to determine what it's worth. We will look at past sales that are similar to it and compare them to our subject property. And we will use that data to help them determine, or to help determine the value. Let me tell you why this is important. Folks, if I asked you all to guess how tall I am, what would you guess?
5'10".
I'm gonna say 5'8".
I was gonna say 5'6".
I have no idea because I have not seen you stand up.
There you go. Every single one of you who made a guess, it was just an absolute shot in the dark. For all you know, I could be 3 foot nothing and I am sitting on 6 chairs, okay? You have no idea.
You got some phone books.
I've got some phone books, that's right. Here's the point. Say what? What's a phone book? There you go. Here's the point. You have nothing to base it off of. Now, if I was to stand next to that picture and I said that picture was sitting at 5'8" and I was right here, now you could make a much more educated guess, couldn't you? Because you had a basis of comparison. Same thing with houses. If I asked you to say, what is a house worth that's 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and the zip code 27526? None of you have a clue. It's not enough information. So we use the information that we have, past sales, to make educated guesses on this property. Does that make sense? So we're about to talk about these in great detail, but let me just give you the rundown here. The sales comparison approach is the most common approach used for residential properties, things that we have a lot of data on. The cost approach is commonly utilized for things that we don't have a lot of data on and are not necessarily income producing. Churches, hospitals, schools. And then the income capitalization approach is giving something of value based on how much money it makes. So let's expand on these. The sales comparison approach is also called the market data approach. Yes, you will absolutely see it called both on the test. Sales comparison approach, also called the market data approach. So what we do, as I said, is we identify a subject property, meaning the property we're trying to, or an appraiser is trying to figure out the value of. And so they will look at the features of this subject property, and then they will take a look at recently sold properties. We call those comparables, or comps for short. So if we know that this house that is very similar to our house just sold for $400,000, we can use that as a basis of comparison to say, okay, if this one sold for $400,000, how does our subject property stack up? And what do we think our subject property is worth? So I want you to think about it this way. The way that you can talk about the sales comparison approach, here's your subject property, the house that you're trying to determine the value of. Let's say, and I'll put it on the screen here so you can kind of get what I'm saying. Subject property is 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms. Now this is an oversimplification, but this is really what it comes down to. When you look at your comparable property, it would be nice to think that you could find a house that was identical to it. And so what we could say is, okay, well, I found a house identical that just recently sold, and it sold for $400,000. Well, that would lead us to believe that our subject property is probably pretty closely valued at $400,000 as well. But sometimes you can't find a perfect comparable. And so the comparable is different. And so here's what you have to do. You make adjustments to the comparables and you say, okay, maybe our comparable was a 2 bathroom. And so the question you're answering is, okay, well, we know what this 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom house sold for. So using that information, what do we think it would have sold for if it had been identical to our subject property? And so we use this principles of what we call inferior versus superior. Now, folks, this is a very oversimplification, but this is how it works. Think about it. Is 2 bedrooms better or worse than 3 bathrooms? Bathrooms. Is 2 bathrooms better or worse than 3 bathrooms?
Worse.
Worse. Well, it's such an oversimplification, but that's the way you look at it. Dora, do you not agree that 2 bathrooms is worse than 3 bathrooms? I would much rather have 3 bathrooms than 2.
No, I agree.
Okay. Okay. It's just more to clean, Seth. I'm not doing it.
But that's it, though. And so you look at it from the perspective of a buyer, like for myself, right?
But arguably, it is better to have more bathrooms for your guests, right?
Yes.
So here's what we're answering, okay? If our subject property has all these features and it's sitting here, and we've got this comparable that is not as good, here's the question that you're always answering in the sales comparison approach. I know what this inferior comparable sold for, but what would it probably have sold for if it had been identical to our subject property? So we make adjustments. And so we would try to estimate the value of what we think a bathroom might be worth. And so if it is an inferior feature, you would need to add value. So let's say that we think a bathroom is worth $4,000. So what that means is if it was a 4-bedroom, 2-bath, and we knew it sold for $400,000, if it had been a 4-bedroom, 3-bath, we think it probably would have sold for $404,000. That is the whole premise of a sales comparison approach. We use the data that we do have and kind of estimate what features might be worth to help us determine a value or probable sales price, because we use this method too, depending on if you're an appraiser or a real estate broker. So let me take this a little bit further and I'll give you some more examples here. When you're looking for these, the whole name of the game is picking good comparables. You would not pick one that needs a whole lot of adjustments, and they have to be as similar as possible. You cannot compare a manufactured home to a single-family detached home. You cannot compare a townhouse to a modular home. You cannot compare a house that is in a golf course community with amenities to a house that is in the middle of nowhere and then not in a subdivision. So you want to find properties as similar as possible. And then you want to find properties where you make the least amount of adjustments possible, because the least adjustments, the more accurate the data has a tendency to be. So this sales comparison approach we utilize when there is a decent amount of data, which is most often with residential sales. Now we also use this approach to vacant land as well. So when I talk about those adjustments, please understand, folks, you will never make an adjustment to the subject property. The subject property is what we're trying to determine the value of. So we take a look at the comparable that we know the sale of, and we make adjustments to that. We say, if it had been identical to our subject, what would it probably have sold for? Now, the general rule of thumb, folks, is the more recent the sale, the better a comp it is. And you really don't want to go, now be careful on the test and use context clues, but typically we want to stay within the past 6 months. Of course, within the past 2 months would be better, but the past 6 months is kind of the time frame that we want to look at. If you go back 3 years, that is a vastly different market. You can't go that far. And they argue in North Carolina that a comparable that is very similar in a different neighborhood is better than a comparable in the same neighborhood that is very different. I don't know that I agree with that, but that's what they argue. So we want to make sure that it has similar physical features, bedrooms, bathrooms as close as possible, square footage as close as possible, land features, utility, all those things. We also want to make sure that when we pick these comparables, it is what we call an arm's length transaction. An arm's length transaction means it was sold under normal circumstances with nothing weird about it. In other words, if it's sold at an auction, it's not an arm's length transaction. If it was a foreclosure, not an arm's length transaction. If it's sold to a family member, it's not an arm's length transaction. So an arm's length transaction is one that is sold in an open and competitive market with competent parties. Now, North Carolina, you are required to use a minimum of 3 comparables to help determine an appraisal or a probable sales price, depending on if you're an appraiser or a broker. Do not use more than 5. So 3 to 5 is what we say in North Carolina. And of course, as I said, we look at the features, we look at the terms of the sale, we look at the dates, all these different things. Now, once again, when I say we, both the appraisers and the real estate brokers look at this. Same methodology, different outcome.
Now, Seth, what about distance-wise, as far as radius? Did that play a role?
Yeah. Now, there's no set rule there. I mean, the general rule of thumb is you probably don't want to go outside of, a couple mile, a max 5 mile radius because geographic areas, remember location, location, location. You could be in North Raleigh and you can be in downtown Raleigh. Those are very different markets. It's not enough to just say Raleigh. So you do very close. You do not want to go very far away. But there's no definitive radius that you have to memorize for the test. Close. No. So we want the fewest adjustments possible, as we keep saying. We want an arm's length transaction. We want a minimum of 3. We only make adjustments to the comps. Now let me give you a visual here to help you kind of understand how this works. Now, this is not the CMA itself, but this is where, when I told you we're trying to figure out what a feature might be worth, you use that concept of contribution to help figure this out. Okay? So if you look in a market and you say, okay, well, I've got a comp that's 3 bedrooms and it sold for $250,000, and you look in a very similar market, similar time frame, there's another home that is identical, except it has 4 bedrooms and it sold for $254,000. I'm sorry, $254,500. Well, folks, if you take a look at these comps in the same market, and the only difference between them is that 1 bedroom, and the one with the extra bedroom sold for $4,500 more, that tells us that in that given market, a bedroom probably contributes $4,500 to the value of a property. Or in other words, taking away a bedroom takes away $4,500. This is how, in a nutshell, we would determine the value of a feature. Now, don't worry, on your test, we're not going to ask you to do like crazy in depth, like determine the value of a feature thing. But you do have to know that that's how that works. More often than not on a test, we will ask you to do something with the values already given. And so let me show you, kind of paint a picture that I've been explaining to you, because I keep talking about inferior, superior. And so I said, you know, if our comp was inferior, we would need to add value to make it equal. Well, conversely, if our comp was superior, better, we would need to subtract value to make it equal. And so it's always trying to get the comp on the same level as the subject property. So let me show you what I mean here. So we have a subject property that an appraiser was trying to determine the value of, and it is a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 2-car garage, ranch-style home. And if we were to tell you that a bedroom in this market is worth about $4,500, a bathroom's worth about $4,000, and a garage is worth about $5,000. Well, let me take a look at comparable number 1, okay? And so we are taking this and we're comparing it to our subject. So 3 bedrooms versus 2 bedrooms, 2-bath, same, 2-car, same, ranch, same, sold for $120,000. So here's that oversimplification piece. In regard to the bedrooms, is this comp superior or inferior to our subject property?
Inferior.
Inferior. Subject property has 3. The comparable has 2 bedrooms. So it's not as good, so we need to adjust the value up. If it's inferior, we add, superior, subtract. So how much value do we need to add to this comparable?
$4,500.
There you go. So,
Okay, these prices were from a long time ago.
oh my God, yes. Like 1990 never. $120,000. Yeah, that was a while ago. Way to just add. Listen, we got Jacob off it finally, okay? Don't bring it back up. I'm kidding. $120,000 we know is what it was sold for. And so here's what we're saying. It sold for $120,000, this comparable did. But if it had been identical to our subject property, it probably would have sold for $124,500. Everybody with me? That makes sense? So then we look at our next comp. Comp 2 is a 3-bedroom, 1-bath, 2-car ranch-style home. Bedrooms are the same. Bathrooms, 2 cars, same. Ranch, same. So now if you're looking at comp 2, is comp 2 superior or inferior compared to our subject property?
It's still inferior.
Inferior yet again. It only has 1 bathroom versus the 2 bathrooms the subject property has. So we need to add value. Inferior, add how much? $4,000. Which is what the value of a bathroom is. So $121,000 is what it sold for. So now we're saying, well, if it had been identical to our subject property, it probably would have sold for $125,000. Last one here, comp 3. 3-bedroom, 3-bath, 2-car ranch-style home. Sold for $130,000. Is comp 3 superior or inferior to our subject property?
Superior.
Superior. It is better by 1 bathroom. Because it has 3 bathrooms, so it's above it, versus the 2 bathrooms. So since it's superior, we need to do what?
Subtract.
Subtract value. How much?
$4,000.
$4,000. So now we're saying, well, this house is better than ours, and it sold for $130,000. So if it had been, yet again, identical to our subject property, it probably would have sold for $126,000. Now here's something that's very testable. If this was an appraiser doing an appraisal using this sales comparison approach, they would use a method called reconciliation. Reconciliation is where they take all these numbers and they would typically utilize another approach to value like the cost approach and give a weighted average to them. Never simple averaging. A weighted average to what the best representation is. Typically, it's mostly sales comparison with a little bit of cost approach as a consideration. The reason they do that is because an appraiser has to give 1 number. They arrive at 1 number as an appraiser. And so they will have to use their skills by way of reconciliation to determine one end value. If this was a sales comparison approach done for a comparative market analysis by a real estate broker, your answer would be left as a range. We don't give one number. So if we did this for our sellers, we would say, well, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we could probably sell your house for $124,500 to $126,000. That's how we give our answer. It's a range. Never a single conclusion of value for us. How are we feeling? Sure, why not?
So Seth, when they have half baths, so you just take half of whatever your bath.
No, it doesn't quite work that simplistically, unfortunately. And please understand, too, that there is no standardized list for this. We would just have to look at features. And so in that last slide I showed you, if we were to look at two properties that were identical, except for this one had an extra half bath, the premise is, and folks, you can see the issue here. The premise is, well, if this one sold for an extra $1,000, maybe the half bath in this market is only worth $1,000. But unfortunately, it's not a perfect science, because I have seen homes that were worse sell for more. Worse meaning less features, but a prettier house. It sold for more, so this is not a perfect science. This is a textbook version. In the real world, it's way more complex, because that thing called common sense has to come into play here. And
I know a lot of houses nowadays have half baths.
Yeah, and they do add value. It's just not a perfect science. So let me take this a step further, because in this one we only dealt with one different feature. But please understand that it's no different if we've got multiple features. It's the same methodology. So now you have to understand that the easiest way to tackle this is to put it in kind of a spreadsheet format. You got your subject property, then you got your features, and then you kind of look at it side by side. So if you look at comp 1, we know that comp 1 sold for $128,500. Well, it's four bedroom versus 4 bedroom, same. 3 bath versus 2 bath. So now this is superior. So we need to subtract for the bath by 1 bath. And then garage versus no garage, inferior. So we need to add the value of a garage. It is okay to make multiple adjustments. So you would adjust for each feature, and you would look at the respective features as superior versus inferior. And so the total adjusted price for comp 1, if it had been identical to our subject property, probably would have sold for $130,500. Same thing with comp 2. Here's what it sold for. It is inferior by a bedroom. Add in, right? Add value, $1,500. It is inferior by a bathroom. Add in, $3,000. There's your adjusted price if it had been identical to our subject property. And then last one, sold for this. Inferior by 1 bedroom, add one, $1,500. Baths are the same, no adjustment needed. Inferior by a garage, so add. And so yet again, a real estate appraiser would use reconciliation to eventually arrive at one conclusion of value. We would give it as a range, low end to high end. So it would be, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you could probably sell your house between $127,300 and $131,400.
I have one more question. And I guess it's because of math. But if in comp 1, everything was the same, 4 bedrooms, 2 bath, and the garage, and it was $128,500, and that's what it sold for. Everything was exactly what you wanted. And then you still have to get 3 comps. Would the appraiser go off the one that was the most similar, or they would still do that weighted?
They would still do that weighted. Yeah. Of course, they wouldn't make adjustments. If it was like tit for tat identical, they would just say, okay, this one sold for this. It's the exact same. There's one comp with that value, but we need more data than just one. So they can't just leave it at that. But yeah, they would.
I know you have to have 3. That's why I was asking, would it still make it a weighted, or if it would?
No, it would still be, weighted. And realistically, the comps, they typically give the comps all the same value. The reason why they don't use simple averaging is because they have to consider a second approach as well, which is typically the cost approach. They give it a little bit of weight on that. So when we're looking at this, I keep saying it, folks, this methodology that we just explained to you is called the sales comparison approach. It is also called the market data approach. Appraisers use this approach to do a residential appraisal. We use this approach to do a CMA for residential properties. Same approach, but they call it one thing, we call it another. It's the approach within the methodology. So, appraisal versus CMA. So we use the same method. It's just that we are using ours to determine a probable sales price or help a buyer determine what a reasonable offer price is based on this information. What you got, Misty?
So the broker's opinion of value is for a customer, is that right? Did I hear you state that?
So if you look in the North Carolina Real Estate Manual, which you can't really see it on my screen, but it's over here, they define a CMA and a BPO as the same thing. It is basically us coming up with a probable sales price using a sales comparison approach. However, the context that they are typically utilized in, we typically call it a CMA when we're saying we did it for a client. And we typically call it a BPO when we did it for a third party, like a bank. So they're not our client. Say what?
Oh, so it wouldn't be like a customer, like a third party.
Well, anybody who's not our client is a customer. But now understand that we...
Could we do it for a bank?
Huh?
Could we do it for a bank, a CMA?
If they hired us to do it, and like I said, it was very commonly done if they were going to foreclose on a property because we're cheaper than appraisers are. Okay. So they would call us up and say, tell me what you think you could sell for in the market and I'll give you a couple $100 versus the $700 appraisal or the $450 appraisal or whatever. So we could do it for anybody that hired us. Now, please don't get confused. You would not do this for a customer in direct contradiction of the CMA that you did for your client. So you would never, like, let's say that you're a listing agent, you would do a CMA for your seller, but if an unrepresented buyer came along and said, give me a copy of that CMA, you say no. You can't, you would not reveal that CMA to them. So don't get it confused that we do it for all customers.
Yeah, I think I'm confused because I know what a CMA is, but I've never heard of a broker's opinion. I'm not understanding. I understand that it's the same thing.
Yeah.
I'm not understanding when would I call it a CMA and when would I call it a broker's opinion?
You call it a CMA if you are doing it for a buyer client to assist them in putting in an offer. You would call it a CMA if you were doing it for a seller client to help them determine a reasonable price to list the house for. You would only call it a BPO if some rando on the street called you up and said, Misty, I'll pay you to tell me what this could sell for.
Okay. Okay.
And so the difference is you're not forming an agency relationship with that person who hired you. The bank calls you and says, I will pay you to tell me what this can sell for. They are not your client because you're not forming an agency relationship with them, but they are paying you for a service. Tell me what it could sell for.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I think I've got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So this is where I kind of told you some of the pieces already. An appraiser gives a very specific value. We give a range of probable sales price. We only use sold properties. Folks, when a home goes under contract, the general public does not know what it goes under contract for. They will not know it until it is closed. And so we cannot use under contract properties. It has to have actually already been closed, and then we can use the data from the MLS as a sold comparable. So under contract, actively listed, none of those can be utilized. And of course, if let's say you do one as part of a listing presentation and then you don't end up listing the house for another 8 months, you need to do another one because things will have changed. That's what it means by keeping it current. And so this is a client level service, meaning this is something that you would be expected to do for clients. And even a provisional broker can do it for a client. Yes, the provisional broker will make a commission, but you're not doing it in a direct exchange for a fee. That was that differentiation, right? So a provisional broker can do a CMA for a client, But a provisional broker cannot do a BPO for a fee, a direct exchange for you do this and I'll pay you. So here's the deal. We've talked about the skill, care, diligence, and old car, and of course license laws and commission rules in North Carolina. So the North Carolina Real Estate Commission does hold you accountable to do this in a competent manner. That is absolutely part of your job. You've got to know what you're doing. Of course, we will teach you how to do this more in depth in post-licensing, so you're not experts on it yet, but you get a basic premise of the textbook version. So you got to know what you're doing to make sure that you represent it correctly for your clients. Now, unfortunately, as I said, the way that North Carolina kind of looks at this, the more similar house in a different neighborhood is typically considered a better comp than a less similar house in the same neighborhood. Like I said, I don't necessarily agree with that from a real world point of view because neighborhoods are very specific. But that information being said to you, take a look at this and tell me what you think.
I would say B. Well, B for me.
There you go. It's not a trick, folks. I steered you in the right direction. There you go. The generalization here is the least adjustments in close proximity, the better. Different markets, Chapel Hill versus Durham, not a good comp. And then a more adjustments but on the same street, they would argue is not as good as a comp. Yeah, there you go. Same thing, Jacob. That's exactly right. That's why I told you the way that I said. For North Carolina, answer the way that I just told you to. I agree. In the real world, I'm going to pick the 3-bedroom, 2-bath on the same street, just so y'all know. In the real world. But for the test purposes, the least adjustments slightly further is considered better. I don't know why. I disagree, but whatever. So let me just scratch the surface on explaining the cost approach to you. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. The cost approach has the most crap to it. And this is why I hate this section. Because, folks, not a single real estate broker in the world, that's not true, not in the world, but I couldn't name a real estate broker that I know that has the skill set to do a cost approach. It is way outside of our wheelhouse. It is a very complex thing that an appraiser does. So I don't know why we have so many stinking questions in this section because it just seems silly to me. But let's talk about the cost approach, folks. The cost approach is the best method to figure out the value for a property there's not a lot of sales data for, and it's not necessarily an income producing property. Churches, schools, hospitals, things of that nature. Let me ask you a question. When was the last time you saw a school for sale?
Never.
Never. They do happen, right? Private schools are for sale. They do exist. But do you see what I'm saying? There's not a lot of data. And so we couldn't use a sales comparison approach because we're going to be like, look, there's a school that sold in 1942. You're right? It's just not very helpful. And so this is the way that we would determine a value for properties where there's not a lot of data and that it's not really based on the income. More often than not, folks, this is for insurance purposes. If we need to know how much to insure the building for, this is the methodology that we use. And so what they basically do, in a nutshell, is let's say that you're looking at this church or cathedral, whatever this building is on the screen. What they basically say is, okay, well, let's take a look at that building and let's decide what it would cost to rebuild that building as it sits, stick for stick, brick for brick. And once we determine the value of it new, or the cost of it new, let's subtract out what we call depreciation. Depreciation is reducing the value based on factors. Depreciation happens in businesses with equipment. Depreciation can happen with cars, with real estate. And so, of course, when something is brand new, it is worth more than when it ages out. And so the presumption here is, folks, houses can last for hundreds and hundreds of years if they're taken care of. But if you don't maintain a house, it will eventually do what?
Fall down.
Fall down, crumble, get eaten by termites, rot away, something. And so that's what we're looking at. What would it cost to build this brand new minus depreciation, meaning minus age or some other factors? And so that helps us determine the current value of that building. Now we look at the building as its own thing, and then we add the value of the land in separately. Why? Because land doesn't depreciate. Land is forever. Remember those physical characteristics, okay? Permanence. It is always going to be there. Now, of course, acts of God or nature not aside, but we look at it exactly like that. What would it cost to rebuild this stick for stick, brick for brick, minus depreciation, add the value of the land back in separately? That's the cost approach. The reason why it sucks so bad, for lack of a better word, is because there's about 500 different ways that you could depreciate that building. There's about 500 different ways that you could calculate the replacement cost of that building. That's the problem. 105 years old. Is it in good condition, Misty? It looks like it from this picture, yeah. It's been maintained.
Yeah, built in 1919.
1919. See, and that's the difference, because I had a house that I listed a couple years back. It was built in 1905, and it was a turd on a stick.
I love old homes.
I, at this point in my life, very much enjoy the character and the sturdiness and the lumber and all that stuff. But there are good ones and there are bad ones, right?
This house was built by the trees that were cut down, milled right here on the land.
Very cool. If you've ever seen the comparison for like the old lumber versus the new lumber, it's very telling, right? Old lumber is typically very old, and so it's got a lot of rings, so it's super, super solid and sturdy. And the new lumber has way less, and so it's not nearly as dense. And so that's why they say, you know, people are stupid. Everybody wants a brand new house, but a lot of these older houses are built, you know, more sturdy than they are. If they were maintained and if they were done correctly. Because just like anything, some people didn't know what they were doing when they built those old houses. So, but yeah, they do have a lot of character. They're cool. So let me just introduce, and let me skip forward here. I want to show you this if I can find, it's not even in here. Let me explain some of this, okay? When you're dealing with that building, there are three methods for determining that building brand new. There is what we call the square foot method, which is basically where we look at a similar property that was built. And we say, okay, what did this property cost to build per square foot? And then you multiply that by the square feet of your building. That's the most common. It's called the square foot method. Then there is what we call the quantity survey method. The quantity survey method is ridiculous. It is quite literally estimating the amount of nails you need and the cost, the amount of lumber you need and the cost, the amount of drywall you need, bricks you need, mortar you need, and the cost of installation of all these. So in reality, the quantity survey method would say this would require 10,682 pieces of lumber. This would require 25,672 nails. It would require 17,000 feet of drywall. It's nuts. It makes no sense whatsoever. Folks, it's asinine. I don't understand why this is even a methodology. But it quite literally, it's called the quantity survey method. and I'm sure it's in the textbook. It literally counts out every single piece of everything and the cost of installation of that piece. And then there's what we call the unit in place method, which is similar, but a little, yeah, there you go, Misty. I was waiting on it. Misty said, yeah, it's in there. I got it. 239. The quantity survey method, the unit in place method, which is basically where we say price per square foot for flooring, price per square foot for, insulation, price per square foot. So it's kind of an in-between methodology. But see, just that alone, there's these different methods of determining the replacement cost. Now, here's the other thing to understand. In the replacement cost of this new building, there's also two other things that come into play. There is replacement cost versus reproduction cost. Replacement is building it with today's methodologies. Let's say that it was a big old chapel like this built in 1900. Well, if we don't care about it having the same aesthetic, it would be like, okay, what does it cost to just replace it with a very similar functional building? That's replacement cost. Reproduction cost is keeping the same historic authenticity. Same corbels, same plaster, same stonework, same everything. As you might imagine, reproduction cost is way more expensive because some of these materials are very hard to find. Do you see the levels of bullcrap that are in this cost approach? I know. I think it is cruel and unusual to even teach this to you, let alone add more questions to this. I don't know.
So which one do they use?
It depends. It depends on the structure. It depends on the insurance policy. It depends on the individual appraiser. It depends. There is no one size fits all, which is why all of these terms can be testable. You could see quantity survey, unit in place, square foot. You could see reproduction versus replacement. Now, in a nutshell, though, what it comes down to for the cost approach, cost to rebuild the building. That's why, because I kept saying building. Rebuild the building brand new, minus depreciation, add the value of the land back in separately. Now, I'll tell you another reason why this is a pain in the butt. Depending on, yet again, the way that they look at this, sometimes the cost approach also automatically utilizes the sales comparison approach. Because I told you raw land typically utilizes the sales comparison approach. So what they will do is they'll take a look at that parcel of land and they'll pretend nothing is on it, and they'll use the sales comparison approach to determine the value of that land separately, and then add that depreciated building and that together. So if you get a question that says the cost approach sometimes utilizes the sales comparison approach for the raw land, that's a true statement. So, last note as to what you're seeing over here. This is what we would call a blanketed way of looking at depreciation. Okay, there is other ways, just like there's different methodologies to determine the replacement value. There is different ways of calculating depreciation. So when we talk about the effective age, we are basically saying based on factors, how old do we consider it? Now, this is not actual age. So Misty's house is 105 years old, but her effective age may only be like 20. You can roll back the clock based on upkeep. So how old do we treat it as? And this is why houses can be utilized and valuable for hundreds of years, because repairs and maintenance and things can roll back the effective age, how old we're considering it. Economic life. Go ahead, Misty.
I was going to say, we just got a new roof 2 weeks ago. We replaced all the windows. We put hardwood floors in. We've remodeled the bathrooms.
You're rolling back that clock, right? Yeah.
But we still love this place.
If only it was that simple with us, right? To roll back the clock. Now, if you're share, it works, right? If you're share, you can just get a facelift and then another facelift and some plasma treatments and then some acid peels and then some Botox. I don't know. Share, the woman is crazy. I don't know. So economic life is basically the presumed period of usefulness. Okay, the time period. In other words, if you did no repairs, how long until it's worth 0? So if your economic life is 60 years, what we're saying is if you do nothing to it, after 60 years, it's worthless. Of course, you can roll back the clock for that effective age. Now, when we're dealing with depreciation this way, this is what we call the age over life method. So basically, what the useful life is versus what we think the age is. So in other words, if the effective age is 30, and the economic life is 60, you would depreciate it by 50% because it is halfway through its economic life as it currently sits. So age over life, think of it like a fraction. 30 over 60 would be 50%. What you got, Jacob?
I'm not following this part.
Which part? I mean, like, I know you mean this part, but like...
Just like the effective life, I guess. Like rolled back, like you can't make a building be built later.
No. But this is not chronological. This is not actual dates. And so let me give you an example here. Let's say that we're dealing with a building and an appraiser determines that a useful life for that type of building is 60 years. And that what they're basically stating is, okay, well, if you do nothing to maintain this building, when it is built brand new, after 60 years, it'll be worthless. Does that make sense? Okay, so economic life is how long we think it would be good for if you did nothing. So if you were to do nothing over 60 years, they may be right, they may be wrong, but they had to kind of give it an economic life. Now, when they look at a building, they're going to say, okay, based on the features, based on the way it looks, based on all this, how old do we really consider this building to be? And so this building, like Misty's house, was built 105 years ago. An appraiser could look at it and say, this thing looks brand new. And they could give it an effective age of it really should only be treated as if it's only 3 years old because it's got so much life left in it. And at that point, we use the correlation of the effective age over the economic life to depreciate it. So let's say, in this instance, that they determined that the effective age was 3 years. 3 divided by 60 is only 0.05% depreciation. And so if the value of this property was $400,000 brand new, they would only take away 0.5%, I guess is what it actually is. It's 5% depreciation, not 0.05. So in other words, 400,000 times 95%. It is worth $380,000 using the age over life method because the effective age is 3 on an economic life of 60. So we're going to depreciate it for the years spent. That is a method of depreciating to determine value.
And this is all put on the tail end of after figuring out how much it would cost to build this church.
Correct.
Brand new nowadays to try to get the value.
There you go. This is one method of depreciating that brand new building.
Okay.
There you go. Now, I'll leave it at that because I'm sure your brains are all completely hurting. So y'all can just talk to me for the last 4 minutes. So tomorrow...